Hi, everyone. So, as we all know, we're going to be working with domes in the next few weeks. And I wanted to give you some tools for working with domes that you can start kind of getting the grips with in advance. So, I'm going to share my screen with you and show you a few tools I've been working with. Before we do that, I also just wanted to show you a quick clip of some projects in action in the dome I was able to get in over the weekend and run some projects, and it looks really neat. And this is one of the files I'll be talking to you about today that you can kind of take a look at in terms of getting some inspiration and some ideas for your personal dome projects. We can see how kind of different shapes kind of work better or not so well on the dome. This one here is a bit asymmetric, so it didn't work so well. This circular spherical thing works really well because it kind of directly maps. So that's going to be something that we'll kind of take into account. So in the week five files I'm providing you, I'm just going to go through these fairly quickly so you get an idea of some of these pre-visualization tools and some of the things that we're able to do with TouchDesigner to map on our computers to a DOM. So the first thing that it's really good to be aware of is this thing called the projection top. And what we can see here is I've selected just four ramp generators. It's the same top, just creating vertical, horizontal, circle, and this rotating line. And what we can see with the projection top, if we go into the projection top settings, is we have a few different options. So let's just create a projection top as a new object and connect that up. So what we can see here is that immediately we're getting an error. And this is because the input is not correct. So in terms of the input, it's going to look for a specific input. Right now, it's looking for a cube map, which we're not giving it. We're giving it something called equirectangular. So if we select equirectangular, it's going to input, and in this case, output equirectangular. Generally, what we want to do for a dome setting is switch that up to fisheye. So we can see here that now that's being morphed into more of a fisheye orientation. And we have this FOV angle, which we can think about as sort of a pushing and pulling away from the lens. And we also have these rotations. So if we set that to a 90 degree, we're mapping that around the dome. In this case, we're creating a sort of a circle that looks similar to this. And that's one of the things that's kind of interesting about working with domes is we can use projection to make things fit into a dome in a better way, or we can leave things as they are. As in this case, this thing is circular. It doesn't really need any modification because that circle is going to map more directly to the dome, and in this case as well. We can also maneuver things into cube maps if we wanted to, which would then allow us to do other projections. So these are the sort of the basic things we can do with TouchDesigner and the projection top to allow us to work in the dome. Another tool that's worth bearing in mind is lens distort. And what lens distort allows you to do is create warping distortions in your project. So for example, if you have something and it's not quite mapping correctly, you can play around with lens distortion to sort of map in a slightly more organic way. In this instance, I've gone quite far, but let's say I wanted to create something a bit more dramatic. Could work with these to manipulate more intensely. Change the focal length or the optical center, and you can create some quite interesting changes. You could even think about automating these to map to the dome in different ways. Now, that's all very good to see, but we will have a better idea of how these things will map if we actually have a pre-visualization tool. So I've actually built a pre-visualization tool that allows us to see what's going on in a dome mapping. So basically, really simple here is we have whatever we put into this Dome previous cam view, which I've also made available as a TOX file, which you can just grab and drop into any of your projects like this. But what we can do is we can just go on this side panel here. We can rotate. We can check up here to see different projections within the dome. We can be outside. If we hold the Alt key and middle mouse, we can zoom. Right click and drag, we can move it around. So we can kind of see what this visualization looks like. If we go onto the settings of this previous tool, we also have this background grid and we have light. So we can light it as if we have, a texture on it, or we can take that light off. But we can use this background grid to see how things are mapping to that dome. So that can be quite useful. And basically, in this case, anything we run into this, let's create a noise top. Let's turn off that previous. We can see that that is mapping to the dome in a specific way. We could also see how that would look if we added in things like a projection top, like a fisheye. And that now maps around more like it's a long texture that we're viewing from a FOV angle. So that's a way that you can do dome pre-visualization. And if you want to get a bit more information on that, the tool that I've kind of used to inform some of the work I've been doing in the dome has been this delicious dome mapping tutorial, which I'll link to by Michael McKellar. Um, Before we kind of finish up this kind of like little dome preview, I'm just going to show you a couple more files. This is a multi-dome example. And so this includes a lot of what we've already looked at. I'm going to exit this by pressing U into my main project. And basically, if we look at the comments I've put here, if we press the keys 2 to 6, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6, it gives us different dome images that we can project. And if I press 1, it's clearer here. If I press 1, it resets any feedback loops you might have. So these are networks I've built, and we can kind of look at those networks in these different components. And basically, I'm just switching between them using my keypad and a switch object. But what we can see is it's linked up to the dome in this sense. So we can see these different objects pre-visualized. And you can also see how I have mapped these specifically. If you kind of go back to that video that I shared earlier, if I can find QuickTime, which I cannot. Let's just go quickly here. If we go back to that video that I shared earlier, we can see how these map quite well in different ways. This is the dome from below. So we've got that first image, we've got this noise particle texture, and we have this sphere, which you can see starts very kind of dome mapped, and then it gets a bit asymmetrical. So this one doesn't quite work so well before going into this sphere, which works a lot better because it's more symmetrical to the center of the dome. So you can kind of experiment with some of these tools and just see how these are implemented. This siphon spout out, we can disregard. This is basically just the way of sending that texture out to the dome mapping software when we actually are in the dome. Let's zoom out here so we can actually see how that maps. This one's looking quite cool like this. So feel free to go into some of these networks and see how I have developed these tools as well. I also have a couple of other tools that just might be a bit of fun. The first one is a slit scan effect mapped to the dome using that pre-visualization tool. And slit scan is a really fun effect for working with your camera if you're not familiar. So what this does essentially, and you've probably seen this before, it's like a house of mirrors. So I have a texture that's basically in a feedback loop. A very thin part of that image is getting captured and displaced every time. So basically that frame is stretching out. And we can move this position to, wherever we want in our texture. So if we, for example, move this rectangle, which is what is controlling this, we could move it. See, it's moving further to the left. So if I move further to the left, that's my new input. So basically we have this one little section of the image, and then I'm putting that through a feedback loop, which is including a transform. But the reason this is kind of cool is that it allows us to have this effect on the dome. We can kind of see how it would look in 3D if we had a camera that was stretching. This might give you an idea for some of your projects and how that would look in a three-dimensional space. We can see that the way I've mapped it allows me to have something that feels like a sort of more landscape texture rather than if we kind of did something different. So in this case, we can see how the projection allows it to feel more like we're in the space versus this where it's kind of going over our heads and feels a bit more asymmetric. So this is kind of cool. And then one more kind of example that you could maybe play around with that again uses the camera. I really hate this reactions tab. But this is going to essentially recreate a effect that you might, kind of remember being on Zoom back in the day, Zoom calls like we are right now. And what I've done here is I'm using a texture delay to take my input and delay it by a certain amount. But this is again how we could map that to the dome. So we have this hello, and this would look quite trippy within a dome-like space, right? Like having lots and lots of versions of a camera. Let's just turn this off for a second so we can see everything here. So basically what's happening here is I'm taking my video device in, hi, and I'm plugging it into a Texture 3D. Now, what a Texture 3D does is it allows us to take a number of images. So it's basically like a buffer of images that we might have kind of used before in, say, P5JS. We might have stored lots of images in an array and then recalled them. In this case, I'm mapping it to my grid. So the rows and columns, each one's going to have an individual image associated. And then we can use that mapped to a texture that we then recall. So that texture 3D is then being recalled by whatever input we have into our component. And in this case, it's a bit more advanced than what we've looked at before. But what I'm doing is obviously using my regular kind of instancing to position things in a grid. And we can see, obviously, this is a grid until we warp it. So this is our grid. And the reason I've used chop rather than top data or SOP data like we've used before is because I also want to have a texture coordinate here as well. So what I'm using here is I'm using this B coordinate from the null, so the blue. It could be you could also use the red. And basically what this is doing is it's giving us a texture coordinate that relates to this constant. So you don't have to worry too much about that. All you have to really do is think about what you'd like to manipulate this with. So for example, right now I'm manipulating this with this ramp top that I'm scaling, but let's say I used a horizontal ramp. What we'd see is the mapping is going to move a little bit differently. That one's kind of cool actually, versus a vertical ramp where we can see the delay is different, or a radial ramp. And so basically what's happening here is it's related to the blue or whatever you select pixel. So basically the intensity of that. And if we use a noise, it's going to be much more diffuse. It's not going to be in a specific pattern, especially if I kind of play with some of the things like that exponent and that amplitude and even add in some gain. we can see how it doesn't quite line up. So these are some fun tools that you can play with and kind of imagine how this might look in a 3D space. It's kind of like the Matrix, if anyone's seen that in the second movie where Neo comes in to see sort of the engineer of the Matrix, and there's this big wall of LED screens with all these people that are essentially all the paths of Neo. But this might be something fun to play around with. And I'm going to sort of close this up and finish up this little segment. Hopefully, you have some ideas of things that you could add to the dome, and hopefully, these tools will be fun and exciting for you. And looking forward to seeing some of these projects come to fruition in the next few weeks. So, have a good rest of the week, and I look forward to hearing about all the work that you do.